If not, we are going to move on. We've got Andrew Knudsen up next here. Andrew is an attorney with Gunderson, Palmer, Nelson, and Ashford in Rapid City, and concentrates his practice in the areas of estate planning and business law. He's done all sorts of really great CLEs, so he's totally going to wipe my clock here with presentation materials. So, thank you.
That was a good introduction. Nothing like saying stuff that you have a hard time moving up to. Like most of you, I'm on a very careful balance of caffeine and sugar on just the right amount on this beautiful Friday afternoon. Thank you all very much for sticking with us. We got just one more speaker. That's it. It's just me. And then we get on to the panel, real fun stuff. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about getting better, doing good, working on my grammar, and best practices, right? Disclaimer, we're talking about best practices, of course, right? I gotta have a disclaimer up there for everybody. But, you know, we're talking about nonprofit corporation law today. The Nonprofit Corporation Act, right? I can form a nonprofit corporation under South Dakota law, and then I can go seek a tax exemption, right? How many people here, again, are with a nonprofit? Okay. And of those, how many are 501c3s? Okay, C4s, C7s? Most people are 501c3s. Most of what we're talking about today are going to apply to those 501c3 nonprofit corporations as far as the best practices go. Now, if I form a corporation, a nonprofit corporation in South Dakota, you know, I'm governed by the same South Dakota Corporation Act, whether or not I apply for a C4 or C3. So your tax exemption is not going to change by the implementation of the new act, right? Unless you do something affirmative to change it, okay? So that's just another point I want to make it out there, that we have this IRS tax law which governs so much of how we have to act as a nonprofit. But then we have this South Dakota corporate law, right, which is a state law deal. So I like to think of it this way, you know, Bobby had some great pictures too about 1965 and the current. You know, they're both phones, right? We got two black phones here. We have a nice rotary phone, we have an iPhone 6. Now, you can stay under the old act like we've told you numerous times today, and you can continue to make your calls, right? I look at it this way, that the new act is, you know, it has all the good stuff from the old act, and yet it has a lot of things that you can do that you just couldn't do before, like domestications, like we talked about, conversions, things that are very useful to have in your toolkit. So today, what are we talking about, right? Best practices. I say mind your manners, right? Your manners of acting. And that's really what best practices are, putting in policies and procedures in place that your employees, your officers, your directors can follow on a day-to-day basis to make sure that things are doing how they should be done. Now, what we're going to talk about today, these slides that I have now are not in your written materials. Under my tab, I have written materials, and I'll be referring to them off and on under the Knudsen tab there. And these PowerPoint slides are up on the website, stbar.org or statebarssouthdakota.com. You'll be able to find all the materials that we're using today and be able to reference them there. So again, what are best practices, right? Like this Dilbert cartoon illustrates, you know, we'll be adopting the best practices in our industry, just like everyone else. If everyone else is doing it, best practices is the same thing as mediocre. And stop making mediocrity sound bad. A lot of what we do and tell people to do as best practices are you doing these things? And most of you already are. Most of what I talk about today, most of the policies I talk about today, you're already doing. What we're throwing out there is little nuggets about how the new act is going to impact that, and maybe some new considerations you want to have under the new act, as well as hopefully going back and looking at your own policies, your own bylaws, and seeing, do I need to, he raised this issue, does our policy address that, right? And I also heard that when you're explaining comics, they get funnier, right, if I explain them and read them to you, right, than just reading them. Management and control. Who manages and controls the corporation, right? The directors and the officers. As far as that goes, the board of directors, right? That's where we focus mainly on implementing these policies and these bylaws. And that's the oversight role. That's the oversight role of the board of directors. They're not in charge of the day-to-day activities. How many people here serve as a director on a nonprofit corporation? I do. I serve on a couple. And I know a lot of attorneys that do. It's a common thing to have done. A lot of us serve as volunteers, and I'm going to get to that. As serving the director role. But really the directors and the officers have the authority to bind the corporation. How many directors really should you have? Well, you're required to have 3, okay? And then the thought is, well, but what if I had like 60? Okay, well you could. Under the old act and the new act, if you have to have a quorum to actually be able to vote on something and have it be official and part of the policy of the corporation, I have to have a majority. My articles or my bylaws can say, no, you can have a quorum with only a third of your directors. So if you have 60 directors, that's all well and good. You have these, connections in the community, but can you really get 20 people there every week? That's 1/3 of the quorum. And I also referenced the new act here for, your directors. And, the new act, just again, a lot of what it does is clarify. Now, the new act says if you're present and there's a quorum and it's presumed that you assent to what's going on unless you object, unless you abstain under the procedures laid forth. So again, the new act just kind of makes that clear. Director approval, I put on page 3 in my written materials. I talk about when director approval is required, what types of things are required for directors to be able to implement. Mechanics of acting. How can a board of directors act, right? We have notice, and Alex had alluded to, notice electronically. That's all clarified in the new act, and I clarify that too on the bottom of page 3 of my written materials. Now, technology is another big thing, right? This new act really helps us deal with today's technology. For instance, under the one thing the old act really did address, and the new act addresses as well, is making it clear that I can have a meeting, I can be at a meeting of the board of directors as long as all of the directors can hear each other by any means, by any electronic means, right? Whether it's Skype, whether it's telephonic. And again, the new act really expands upon that. Committees, like Bobby had mentioned, the board can have committees. Under the current law, you have to have at least 2 directors serve on a committee of the board. Under the new law, you can have 1. You just need 1 director at least to have a committee of the board. And this is a big change. Designated bodies. Has anybody here heard of designated bodies before? This is something that does not exist under current law. This is purely a new act deal, okay? A designated body is something that the board of directors can put in place. So the board of directors can amend the bylaws or the articles, and the bylaws can provide that a certain group or person or entity is vested with certain powers and responsibilities of the board of directors. And this can be perpetual. And what's interesting is I can create this designated body. Nobody on the designated body has to be a director of the corporation. Okay? And to the extent I delegate my powers, the board powers, or powers of the members rather too, to the designated body, the board of directors or the members are relieved of responsibility and fiduciary duty as to what we've designated to this designated body. Okay? All I have left is my oversight duties as a director, right? My oversight, my day-to-day. Now, not the day-to-day. So, under the new act, you can have a committee of the board, which is consisting of 1 director or more. Okay? You can have an advisory committee. An advisory committee, they do not have to be directors at all, but they cannot exercise powers that the board of directors would otherwise have to be able to exercise under current law, okay, or under the new law. And then we have designated bodies. And the difference is designated bodies don't have to be directors. They can exercise powers of the board, even though they're not directors, to the extent that they've been delegated those powers. So, why would you ever want to do this? Imagine if you had a group of founders that, 3 people founded this nonprofit organization. Time has gone on, and they don't want to be a full-on director. They don't want to go to all the meetings. They don't want to have the duties that a director has to have. But everybody decides that we really want them to have control over this one aspect, okay, or this camp that we put on, or this distribution of this asset, and just vested in that designated body. So now, I'm a founder. I can have my one very limited role, but I don't have to have all the duties that a director has to do. Volunteer protection. Bobby alluded to this earlier. We have some of the very best protection for liability laws in the entire nation. Protecting people that are serving without compensation. Now, there's the federal law, and there's a Federal Volunteer Protection Act of 1997. And that federal law, and this is all in your materials, Appendix A, actually, under my tab. If you go to Appendix A now, you can see I've laid down the actual federal statutes there and regulations which address this specifically. And essentially, the Federal Volunteer Protection Act says if a volunteer is volunteering for a nonprofit corporation that's also tax exempt, that volunteer is not going to be liable for their actions under certain circumstances. And about that is though that they say, well, as long as the harm is not caused by willful or criminal misconduct, gross negligence, reckless misconduct. So there's a lot of caveats there. But the whole idea was if somebody's volunteering for an organization, we don't want them to be hit with liability personally for their actions as a volunteer. Now, the federal law said that we preempt inconsistent states. But if a state wants to have stronger volunteer protection, then go ahead and do it. And South Dakota did. This is one of the really only major updates to the 1965 law that we put. And if you look at Appendix A in my materials, on page 5 of Appendix A, we have this South Dakota Codified Law 4723 2.1. And this is the volunteer protection. There's other volunteer protection statutes which I lay out here, but this is the big one. And what it says is that we actually call out specifically no director, trustee, committee member, officer serving without compensation is serving without compensation, which does not include reimbursement for expenses. I can still get reimbursed for expenses, and that doesn't count as compensation to me. But if I'm a director or an officer or anybody volunteering for a nonprofit corporation that's also tax exempt, then I am not liable. And it also says no cause of action can be brought. They're not even supposed to be able to bring the lawsuit, right? Except where what I did or what I omitted to do was willful or wanton misconduct, meaning, I intentionally did something very specifically. Willful and wanton misconduct is a big burden to get to. And notice we take negligence out of there, even gross negligence. So if I screw something up as a director, I'm most likely not going to be personally liable. Okay, that's great. And these volunteer protection statutes that we have, that I put in my Appendix A, we call these out because we're taking them verbatim from the current law, and it's also under the new act. So whether or not your nonprofit elects the new act or stays under current law, you still have the same volunteer protection statutes that South Dakota does. And we call that out because it's a very strong statute that we've implemented here for specific reasons. Now, that's why it's important that, when am I not protected, right? I'm only protected, I'm a volunteer director on a couple different nonprofit boards, and so I'm protected under this statute. As long as I'm acting in my official capacity as a director or an officer of that, which is, again, why when I'm acting with somebody on behalf of the corporation, or if I'm signing something, make sure it's always comma director or comma member of the board or something to designate your representative capacity. It's not Andrew, it's Andrew as a director, okay? But although the volunteer themselves might not be personally liable, well, the corporation still can be, right? Even for actions done by this volunteer director. So although the director themselves is off the hook, a lot of times the corporation can be held liable for, say something they did cause back taxes, penalties. My negligent actions didn't get me in trouble, but it got my corporation in trouble. Okay? And my board service, if I am compensated, or even if I'm not, my board service is not covered by, my professional liability insurance, my legal malpractice insurance, right? So it's, again, that's why that volunteer protection statute is strong, and why I prefer to serve without compensation. But this is where liability insurance comes into play, right? Because even though I might be off the hook, I might still incur expenses. I might cause liability to my corporation. And that's where we have these liability protection insurance come into play. Errors and omissions, directors and officers policy, E&O, D&O insurance policies. Sometimes these are combined into one policy, sometimes they're separate. It depends on the insurance company. But the general idea is to insure the corporation and its agents against negligent acts or omissions that directors, officers, employees commit. And you can cover the agent or the corporation or both. And what do I mean by that? So say if I do something that causes a liability, I can be reimbursed by this insurance for the penalty that I got, for the damages I caused, and so can the corporation. Sometimes it covers both, sometimes it doesn't. And again, that's something you have to look at, whether or not your directors are volunteers and how much they're actually involved. Now, why you should always be looking at whether or not you have an E&O and D&O insurance policy, and why you should consider one, or at least talk to your insurance company about that, is because of the indemnification rules. Okay. Indemnification, when does the corporation have to reimburse me for attorney fees, for costs that I incurred, for damages that I had to pay out? And sometimes it's mandatory, and I cite the statutes there, and I mentioned this indemnification is on page 14 of my materials, where I talk about it more. And I lay out there what's mandatory and what's permissive. Under the law, if I'm a director and I get sued and I'm successful on the merits, then my corporation has to indemnify. Okay, could be a lot of cash that the corporation has to come up with. That can partially be paid by insurance. And sometimes it's permissive. And the corporate documents a lot of times govern what happens too. Your bylaws might say that, yep, under all circumstances we're indemnifying directors and officers. Typically, your bylaws will make it permissive as to employees. So we're not just talking about indemnifying directors, but also employees. And members typically are not indemnified. And why is that? If you are a nonprofit corporation that has members, their exposure to liability is very low anyway, primarily because of just the normal liability protections you have as a corporation. So what do your corporate documents say? What do your bylaws say about indemnification? And do you have the insurance to cover that if you have to indemnify somebody? What about if I'm a director on a nonprofit and I don't get sued? It's not me, the corporation or somebody else gets sued. But I have to be a witness. I have to produce documentation. So I'm not a party to the lawsuit, but it's still taking a lot of my time. Maybe it's expensive. Maybe I also have to have an attorney help me just as a witness or providing documentation. Am I reimbursed for that? Because a lot of bylaws just say that if they're party to the suit. Also, what about advancements? If I'm defending a lawsuit, even if I'm successful, right, it's expensive. Lawyers aren't cheap. And as the lawsuit goes on, the attorneys usually want to be paid at some point. And so can the corporation give them advancement on those funds to pay for the attorneys before we even know what the verdict is? And then general liability. Again, a nonprofit corporation, it's a business, right? And that's, like Bobby said, it's a business. And so you have protection against your general claims, your general liability insurance that most businesses would have. And you have that general liability in place not just to make sure that your nonprofit continues and has the money and the funds to continue to do its mission, but also to adequately compensate those who suffered as well, right? If your corporation, if they don't have the cash to help the victim, right? I mean, there's that aspect of it too. That's where insurance can really come into play. Administrative matters. Now, you can't overstate the importance of minutes. The IRS, in my materials at the end, I have this Appendix B, and essentially it's part of the IRS's best practices guide for nonprofits. You'll see in there. I also allude to a couple of their spots in my materials about where the IRS has some really good written information about what kind of policies you should have and how you should act. And when it comes to governing documents, articles, bylaws, minutes, it's really a state law thing. Minutes need to be contemporaneous, right? We all know that. They should be done at every single meeting, whether it's an advisory committee, whether it's a committee, whether it's a designated body, whether it's the board, whether it's an officer's meeting. Minutes aren't just for the board of directors. Minutes should also be for those committees. And then bylaws, articles of bylaws, whether it's the new act or the old act. Again, if the new act is passed, you don't have to update anything. If you want to be governed under the new act, you're going to have to amend your articles and bylaws in some level. And then also, when was the last time they were updated? A lot of people, they have their bylaws. The corporation was started 20 years ago, and we haven't looked at the bylaws since. If you are a volunteer director, so I'm serving on a board of directors for a nonprofit corporation, have you read the bylaws? If you're the nonprofit corporation representative, have your directors read the bylaws? You'd be surprised at how many of them have not actually read the bylaws, even though they're serving as a director of your corporation. Make sure every director has at least read the bylaws once. And then policies. I should also note, if you do something like designated bodies or change your bylaws significantly, that is something that's going to have to be disclosed on the 990 when you file that each year. So there's very few state ongoing rules that you have to follow. Most of what you're dealing with on a year-by-year basis is really going to be the 501c3 and the IRS side of things. On the state level, you have an annual report, and that's just simply sent to you every year. It's a pretty minor deal. But then there's these policies, and like I said, you probably all have these policies, and if you don't, I'd strongly recommend adopting them. The thing about policies is that they can be standalone, they don't have to be part of your bylaws, and you can find them in most places for free. You can find really good examples all over the place. And it's very, very important to have, because these are how you set what your best practices are and how the day-to-day operations of the corporation should work. And a lot of times, if the nonprofit corporation is under a lawsuit or has some IRS compliance issue, everybody goes back to the policies. What were you doing? So, one important policy is the records policy, right? What's required, what's recommended to be held permanently, what's recommended to be held temporarily. A records policy is something everybody should have in place. On page 5 of my materials, I state what's required. What are you required to have as far as records go? And it's really not, really not a lot. But then I also talk about recommended records and how long you should keep those. And the IRS has their 2 cents about this as well. Now, records retention policy and destruction policy is absolutely critical to have in place. And a couple things to look at. I'm sure everybody has a records retention policy. If you don't, you absolutely should. You can find them for free anywhere. I have one in my hand that I'd be happy to email you if you ever needed one. But do you have these things in your records retention policy? Who's responsible for carrying out the policy? This is for all policies that you implement. Who's your administrator, right? I mean, somebody needs to be in charge of making sure that policy is implemented. So make sure at least one person is assigned to one or more policies, that they're in charge of making sure it gets implemented. Destruction, how long I should keep things. This policy I have in my hand here talks about things you should keep permanently. For instance, anything to do with your IRS determination letter, your tax filings, your insurance policies keep permanently, legal contracts. There's other items like, does your policy address email and email records and electronically stored documents, what Alex was talking about. If you do address electronically stored documents, how often are they backed up? How are they backed up? Where are they backed up? And if you implement the new act, you'll have the option of not necessarily having to have it in an actual paper form, but storing electronically. So a big place to update if you do implement the new act. And then again, privacy laws, emergency procedures, your schedule of document retention, and then when you should suspend all destruction, right? Litigation, government audit, just a government investigation. The gift acceptance policy is a very critical policy, and this is one of those policies where you put this on your website or you make it known. There's a lot of policies that are internal, and there's policies that apply for directors and officers, and policies that apply to everybody, agents, employees. But this is one where I don't see it all that often on people's websites, but it really should be. And so think about it when you're looking at your policies. Who's the audience?